The shovel bit into cold earth with a sound like breaking bones. Henry Cole's casket sat beside the open grave, plain pine with brass handles that had already begun to tarnish. No flowers, no mourners, just the gravedigger, a man named Tom Reeves, who had buried 347 people in his 22 years at Riverside Veterans Cemetery, and had never once seen a funeral this empty. Tom checked his watch. 2:17 in the afternoon. The service had been scheduled for 2 o'clock. He had waited the customary 15 minutes, standing beside the casket with his cap in his hands, scanning the empty road that wound through the cemetery gates. No cars came, no family, no friends, not even the standard military honor guard that usually showed up for veterans, even the forgotten ones. Henry Cole would go into the ground alone. Tom had seen the file. 83 years old, served in Korea and 2 tours in Vietnam. No surviving family listed. No emergency contacts. The man had died in a VA nursing home on the east side of town, found in his bed on a Tuesday morning by a nurse who said he looked peaceful. The funeral was paid for by a small life insurance policy Henry had maintained for decades, just enough to cover a basic casket and a plot in the veterans section. The gravedigger walked to the mechanical lowering device, a system of canvas straps and pulleys that would ease the casket into the earth. He had done this alone before. Sometimes old soldiers died with nobody left to remember them. Sometimes the world just moved on and left them behind, relics of wars that younger generations only read about in history books. But something about this one felt different. Tom had opened the casket that morning for the standard pre-burial inspection. Henry Cole's face had been gaunt, weathered like old leather, but there was something in the set of his jaw, even in death, that spoke of a man who had carried weight. Not the weight of medals or rank, but something heavier, something that left marks you couldn't see. The gravedigger positioned the straps under the casket, threading them through the lowering device with practiced efficiency. The November wind cut through the cemetery, rattling the bare branches of oak trees that stood like silent witnesses along the gravel paths. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, harsh and lonely. Tom began to crank the handle. The casket lifted an inch off the gurney, swaying slightly. He would lower it slowly, the way he always did, with dignity, because even if nobody else was here to see it, he believed every person deserved that much. The casket moved over the grave, suspended above 6 feet of darkness. That was when he heard the engine. Tom stopped cranking and turned toward the sound. It was distant at first, a low rumble that seemed to come from beyond the cemetery gates, growing steadily louder. Not the smooth hum of a modern car, but something older, rougher, the kind of engine that rattled and coughed and refused to die. The gravedigger squinted toward the entrance road, through the iron gates, past the stone pillars that marked the cemetery boundary. He saw it. A bus, painted in faded yellow, the kind that had once carried children to school decades ago. It had no markings, no district number, no flashing lights, just chipped paint and windows that reflected the grey November sky. The bus slowed as it approached the gates, then stopped completely, the engine idling with a deep, uneven rhythm. Tom stood frozen, one hand still on the crank, watching. The casket hung suspended above the grave, swaying slightly in the wind. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bus sat there, silent except for the engine, and Tom wondered if the driver had made a wrong turn, if this was some kind of mistake. Cemeteries were not places where buses stopped, especially not buses like this one, which looked like it had been pulled from a junkyard and given just enough life to make one last trip. Then the door opened. The sound was a mechanical hiss, and Tom watched as the first person stepped down from the bus. A man, maybe 50 years old, wearing a simple grey jacket and dark pants. He did not look around. He did not hesitate. He stepped onto the gravel and stood at attention, his back straight, his hands at his sides, his eyes fixed forward. Another person followed, a woman, younger, with black hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a dark coat and moved with the same precise, deliberate steps as the man before her. She took her place beside him, standing at attention, shoulder to shoulder. Then another and another. They came in silence, one after another, stepping down from the bus in a rhythm that felt rehearsed, almost military. Men and women of different ages, different builds, different faces, but all moving with the same purpose, the same eerie synchronization. They formed a line along the gravel path, standing perfectly still, their eyes forward, their expressions unreadable. Tom counted them as they emerged. 10, 15, 20. The line grew longer, stretching from the bus toward the gravesite, and still they kept coming. 25, 28, 30. 30 people standing in perfect formation, silent as the gravestones around them. The bus door closed with another hiss, and the engine cut off. The sudden silence was deafening. Tom could hear his own heartbeat. The wind in the trees, the creak of the canvas straps holding Henry Cole's casket above the earth. He stared at the line of people, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. Who were they? Where had they come from? And why now? After he had waited, after he had assumed Henry Cole would be buried alone, did 30 people suddenly appear, standing like soldiers waiting for orders? The man at the front of the line, the first one who had stepped off the bus, turned his head slightly and made eye contact with Tom. His face was weathered, lined with age and something else. Experience, maybe, or grief that had been carried for a long time. He gave a single small nod, as if to say, "We are here. Begin." Tom swallowed hard and looked back at the casket, still suspended above the grave. His hands were shaking. He had buried hundreds of people, had stood through services with weeping families and stoic veterans and everything in between. But he had never felt anything like this. The air itself seemed to have changed, charged with something he could not name. Slowly, carefully, he began to crank the handle again. The casket descended inch by inch, the straps groaning softly under the weight. The 30 people did not move. They did not speak. They simply watched as Henry Cole's body was lowered into the earth, their eyes never leaving the casket, their posture never wavering. When the casket reached the bottom of the grave, Tom released the straps and stepped back. He expected someone to speak, to step forward, to offer some explanation. But the line remained silent. The wind picked up, colder now, and Tom pulled his jacket tighter around himself. Then, without a word, the 30 people began to move. They did not break formation. They moved as one, stepping forward in perfect unison, their feet crunching on the gravel in a rhythm that sounded almost like a drumbeat. They approached the grave slowly, deliberately, and formed a circle around it, standing shoulder to shoulder, enclosing the open earth and the casket within. Tom stood outside the circle watching, his breath visible in the cold air. He wanted to ask who they were, what they were doing, but something stopped him. This was not his moment. This was theirs. The man at the front of the line, the one who had nodded to Tom, stepped forward. He was older than Tom had first thought, maybe 60, with silver streaks in his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He held it in both hands, staring down at it for a long moment, and then he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the stillness. "Henry Cole saved my life when I was 7 years old." The words hung in the air, simple and heavy, Tom felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the November wind. The man continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. I was pulled from rubble in Seoul. My parents were gone. I had nowhere to go. Henry found me, fed me, kept me alive. He did not have to. He was a soldier. I was just another orphan in a city full of them. But he stayed. The man folded the paper carefully and placed it in his pocket. He looked down at the casket, and for the first time his composure cracked. His jaw tightened, and he blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. He gave me his rations. He taught me English. He made sure I got on a plane to America when the war ended. He gave me a life. Another person stepped forward, a woman with graying hair and a face that had once been beautiful, but was now marked by time and hardship. She did not speak immediately. She simply stood at the edge of the grave, looking down, her hands clasped in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Henry found me in Da Nang. I was 9. My village had been destroyed. I was alone, starving. He brought me food every day for 3 months. He never asked for anything. He just came every single day until he could arrange for me to leave. She paused, her breath hitching. I did not even know his name until years later. I only knew him as the tall soldier who smiled. When I finally found him, decades later, he did not want recognition. He just asked if I was okay, if I had a good life. One by one, they stepped forward. Each person had a story. Each story was different, but the thread that connected them was the same. Henry Cole had found them in the worst moments of their lives, in the chaos and ruin of war, and he had saved them. A man in his 50s spoke of being pulled from a burning building in Saigon. A woman in her 40s told of how Henry had hidden her family from soldiers who would have killed them. A younger man, maybe 35, explained that his mother had been one of Henry's rescues, and that he existed because Henry Cole had refused to leave a pregnant woman behind during an evacuation. Tom listened, his throat tight, his eyes burning. He had thought Henry Cole died alone. He had thought this man had no one. But standing here, listening to these 30 people speak, he realized the truth. Henry Cole had not been alone. He had been surrounded by ghosts, by memories, by the weight of 30 lives he had saved and never spoken about. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. The stories continued, each one adding another layer to the portrait of a man Tom had never met, but now felt he knew intimately. Henry had not been a general or a decorated hero. He had not received medals or parades. He had simply been a soldier who saw suffering and refused to look away. One woman, her voice breaking, explained that Henry had used his own salary to pay for her education. I did not understand at the time, she said, tears streaming down her face. I was just a child. I thought everyone had someone helping them. It was not until I was older that I realized what he had done. He sent money every month for years. He made sure I could go to school, that I could have a future. And he never asked for anything in return, not even a thank you. Another man, his hands trembling, spoke of how Henry had carried him for 3 miles through enemy territory after he had been injured. I was not even supposed to be there, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. I was a local guide, not a soldier. But when the attack came, Henry did not leave me. He carried me on his back, through the jungle, through the gunfire, until we reached safety. I weighed more than he did. I do not know how he did it, but he did. The circle around the grave was silent, except for the voices of the speakers and the occasional sound of someone crying softly. Tom stood outside the circle, his own eyes wet, his chest aching with a grief that was not his own, but felt universal. as if he were mourning not just Henry Cole, but every person who had ever lived a life of quiet sacrifice and died without recognition. As the last few people spoke, Tom began to notice something. The accents. They were different. Some spoke with the clipped precision of Korean English. Others had the softer tones of Vietnamese. A few had accents he could not place, languages that had been learned and layered over each other until they formed something unique, something that belonged only to them. These were not just Americans. These were people from all over the world, people whose lives had intersected with Henry Cole's in war zones and refugee camps and forgotten corners of the globe. And somehow, across decades and distances, they had all found each other. They had all come here, to this quiet cemetery in a small American town, to say goodbye to the man who had given them life. When the last person finished speaking, the circle fell silent. The wind had died down, and the air was still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Tom waited, unsure of what would happen next, unsure if he should step forward or stay back, if he should speak or remain silent. Then the man at the front, the first one who had stepped off the bus, raised his hand. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but the effect was immediate. The 30 people around the grave straightened, their shoulders back, their eyes forward. They stood at attention, and Tom realized with a jolt that this was not just a group of mourners. This was a unit. The man opened his mouth, and he began to sing. The melody was soft at first, almost tentative, as if he were testing the air to see if it would carry the sound. But then others joined in, their voices blending together in a harmony that was both haunting and beautiful. The song was not in English. Tom did not recognize the language, though it sounded Eastern, maybe Korean or Vietnamese, or perhaps a mixture of both. The words were unfamiliar, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. It was a lullaby. Tom felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The voices rose and fell in a gentle rhythm, the kind of song a parent might sing to a child to chase away nightmares, to promise that the world was not as dark as it seemed. The 30 people sang together, their voices strong and clear, and Tom understood in that moment that this was not just a song. This was a memory. This was something Henry Cole had given them. Something he had sung to them in the darkest moments of their lives, when they were children, and the world was falling apart around them. The song continued, filling the cemetery with sound, and Tom saw that many of the singers were crying now, tears streaming down their faces even as they sang. They did not stop. They did not falter. They sang for Henry Cole, the man who had been a father to them when they had no one else. The man who had given them hope when hope seemed impossible. When the song finally ended, the silence that followed was profound. The 30 people stood around the grave, their heads bowed, their hands clasped in front of them. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply stood there, honoring the man who had saved them, the man who had died alone in a nursing home, with no family listed, no emergency contacts, no one to call when the end came. But he had not been alone. Not really. He had carried these 30 people with him, in his heart, in his memory, every day of his life. And now they were here, giving back the only thing they could, their presence, their voices, their love. Tom wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and stepped forward. He did not know what to say, did not know if there were words that could match the weight of what he had just witnessed, but he felt he had to say something, had to acknowledge what had happened here. "I did not know him," Tom said, his voice rough, "but I wish I had." The man at the front of the circle turned to look at him. His eyes were red, but there was a strength in them, a quiet resilience that Tom recognized. It was the look of someone who had survived, who had endured, who had been broken and put back together and was still standing. "He would not have wanted recognition," the man said softly. "He never did. He just wanted us to live, to be okay. That was enough for him." Tom nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The man turned back to the grave, and then, one by one, the 30 people began to move again. They reached into their pockets, their bags, their coats, and each one pulled out a single flower. But these were not ordinary flowers. They were different, each one unique. Tom saw a lotus, a cherry blossom, a hibiscus, a rose, a chrysanthemum. Flowers from different countries, different climates, different worlds. Each person held their flower for a moment, looking down at it, and then they stepped forward and gently placed it on top of Henry Cole's casket. The flowers formed a mosaic of colour against the plain pine, a patchwork of memories and origins and lives that had been touched by one man. Red and white and yellow and pink, petals soft and fragile, resting on wood that would soon be covered by earth. When the last flower had been placed, the 30 people stepped back. They formed their line again, standing in the same perfect formation they had arrived in, and they saluted. It was not a military salute, not exactly, but something close. A gesture of respect, of honor, of goodbye. Tom stood beside the grave, watching as they turned and walked back toward the bus. They moved in silence, their footsteps synchronized, their heads held high. The bus door opened, and one by one, they climbed aboard. The engine coughed to life, and the bus began to roll forward slowly, carefully, making its way back down the gravel path toward the cemetery gates. Tom watched until the bus disappeared from view, until the sound of the engine faded into the distance, and he was alone again with the grave and the flowers and the memory of what had just happened. He stood there for a long time, staring down at the casket covered in flowers from around the world. He thought about Henry Cole, about the life he had lived, the choices he had made, the people he had saved. He thought about how easy it would have been to walk past those children, to tell himself that they were not his responsibility, that he had done enough just by fighting the war. But Henry had not walked past. He had stopped. He had stayed. He had given everything he had, not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Tom picked up his shovel and began to fill the grave. The earth fell softly on the casket, covering the flowers, covering the wood, covering the man who had lived a life of quiet heroism and died without fanfare. But as Tom worked, he felt something shift inside him, something he could not quite name. It was not sadness, though there was sadness. It was not grief, though there was grief. It was something else, something deeper. It was gratitude. Gratitude that people like Henry Cole existed. Gratitude that even in the darkest moments, even in the chaos and horror of war, there were those who chose compassion over cruelty, who chose to save rather than destroy. And gratitude that he, Tom Reeves, a gravedigger who had buried hundreds of people and would bury hundreds more, had been here to witness this moment, to see the truth of a life that might otherwise have been forgotten. When the grave was filled, Tom patted the earth down with the back of his shovel and stepped back. He looked at the mound of fresh dirt, at the flowers that were now buried beneath it, and he made a silent promise. He would remember Henry Cole. He would tell this story. He would make sure that the world knew, even if only in small ways, that this man had lived, had mattered, had changed the course of 30 lives, and through them, countless others. Tom picked up his tools and walked back toward the maintenance shed, his boots crunching on the gravel. Behind him, the cemetery was silent again, the wind rustling through the trees, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon. But the silence felt different now. It was not the silence of emptiness or loneliness. It was the silence of peace, of a story completed, of a life honored. And somewhere, on a bus rolling down a highway toward destinations unknown, 30 people carried Henry Cole with them, in their hearts, in their memories, in the lives they had built, because one man had refused to let them die. The bus rolled through the outskirts of town as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across empty highways and forgotten industrial parks. Inside, the 30 passengers sat in silence, each lost in their own memories, their own private conversations with a man who could no longer answer. The engine rattled and hummed, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to measure the distance between the cemetery and whatever came next. In the third row from the front, a woman named Mai Nguyen stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past. She was 47 years old now, a nurse at a children's hospital in Seattle, but in her mind, she was 9 again, standing in the ruins of her village outside Da Nang, surrounded by smoke and screaming and the smell of burning wood. She remembered the tall American soldier who had appeared through the haze like something from a dream, his uniform dusty and torn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He had knelt beside her, this giant of a man, and spoken to her in broken Vietnamese, asking if she was hurt, if she needed help. She had not understood all his words, but she had understood his eyes. They were kind. In a world that had suddenly become cruel and incomprehensible, those eyes had been the first kind thing she had seen in days. Mai closed her eyes and let the memory wash over her. Henry had come back every day for 3 months. Every single day, without fail. He had brought her food, sometimes just military rations, sometimes fruit he had traded for with local vendors. Once, even a small cake he had somehow acquired for her birthday, though she had never told him when her birthday was. He had simply guessed, had picked a day and declared it her birthday, and had sung to her in English, while she ate the cake and cried because she had thought she would never celebrate anything ever again. She had asked him once, years later, when she had finally tracked him down through a veterans organization, why he had done it. Why her? Why had he chosen to help her when there were thousands of other children, other orphans, other lives that needed saving? Henry had looked at her with those same kind eyes, now older and more tired, and he had said simply, "Because you were there, because I could." Mai opened her eyes and wiped them quickly, not wanting the others to see, but when she glanced around, she realized that many of them were crying too, silently, privately, each carrying their own version of the same story, the same inexplicable kindness that had changed everything. Across the aisle, a man named David Park sat with his hands folded in his lap, his jaw tight with the effort of holding himself together. He was 62 years old, a retired engineer who had spent his career designing bridges in California, but he still remembered being 7 years old and trapped under a collapsed building in Seoul. He remembered the darkness, the weight of concrete pressing down on his chest, the certainty that he was going to die there, alone and forgotten. And then he remembered the hands that had pulled him free, strong hands, careful hands, hands that had dug through rubble for hours to reach him. Henry Cole's hands. David had been unconscious when Henry finally extracted him, had woken up 3 days later in a field hospital with broken ribs and a punctured lung, but alive. He had asked the nurse who had saved him, and she had pointed to a tall soldier sleeping in a chair in the corner, his uniform still covered in dust and blood, his hands wrapped in bandages from where he had torn them open, digging through concrete and rebar. Henry had stayed with him for 2 weeks, visiting every day between his duties, bringing him books he could not yet read in English, teaching him words, making him laugh even though it hurt his ribs to laugh. And when David had been well enough to leave the hospital, Henry had arranged for him to be placed with a family who was immigrating to America, had filled out paperwork and called in favors, and somehow, impossibly, had given a 7-year-old orphan a future. David had tried to pay him back once, decades later, when he had finally made enough money to feel like he could offer something meaningful. He had written Henry a check for $10,000, had driven 6 hours to the small apartment where Henry lived alone, had presented it to him with a speech he had rehearsed about gratitude and debt, and how it was impossible to repay what Henry had done. But this was a start. Henry had looked at the check for a long moment, and then he had torn it in half. "I did not do it for money," Henry had said quietly. "I did it because you were a child, and you needed help. You do not owe me anything. You never did." David had argued, had insisted, had tried to explain that he needed to do something, to give something back. But Henry had been immovable. In the end, David had left the apartment with the torn check still in his hands, feeling both frustrated and strangely lighter, as if a weight he had been carrying for decades had suddenly been lifted. Now, sitting on this bus rolling through the November twilight, David understood. Henry had not wanted repayment, because what he had done was not a transaction. It was not an investment expecting returns. It was simply an act of human decency, done because it needed to be done, and the only thing Henry had ever wanted in return was for them to live, to be okay, to have the futures he had helped give them. If this story touched your heart, click like and subscribe to honor those who served. Near the back of the bus, a younger woman named Sarah Chen sat with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor. She was 34 years old, a teacher in Boston, and she had never met Henry Cole. But her mother had. Her mother, Lin Chen, had been one of the children Henry had saved during the fall of Saigon, had been pulled onto an evacuation helicopter at the last possible moment, 8 months pregnant and terrified, clutching a small bag that contained everything she owned in the world. Lin had told Sarah the story many times over the years, had described the chaos of those final days, the crowds pushing towards the embassy, the helicopters lifting off with people clinging to the skids, the certainty that she and her unborn child were going to be left behind. And then the tall American soldier who had appeared beside her, who had physically lifted her over a fence and carried her through the crowd and placed her on a helicopter that was already overloaded, that should not have taken one more person, but did, because Henry Cole had looked at the pilot and said, "She is pregnant. We are not leaving her." Sarah had been born 6 weeks later in a refugee camp in the Philippines. Her mother had named her Sarah because it was the name of Henry's mother, a detail he had mentioned once during the helicopter ride, shouting over the roar of the rotors, trying to distract Lin from her fear. Lin had never forgotten that kindness, that small human detail shared in the midst of chaos, and she had carried it with her for the rest of her life. When Lin had died 3 years ago, one of her final requests had been for Sarah to find Henry Cole, to thank him, to let him know that the baby he had saved had grown up to have a good life, had become a teacher, had married and had children of her own. Sarah had searched for months, had finally tracked him down to the VA nursing home, had called to arrange a visit. The nurse who answered had been kind but firm. Mr. Cole was not accepting visitors. He had made it very clear that he did not want to see anyone, did not want to talk about the past, did not want recognition or thanks. Sarah had left her number anyway, had asked the nurse to please tell him that Lin Chen's daughter wanted to meet him, wanted to thank him. The nurse had called back 2 days later. Mr. Cole had passed away in his sleep. He had been alone. Sarah had felt a grief so profound it had surprised her, mourning a man she had never met, but who had given her life in the most literal sense possible. She had tried to find information about his funeral, had wanted to attend, to represent her mother, to stand as proof that his actions had mattered. But there had been no information, no obituary, no service announced. It was as if Henry Cole had simply disappeared from the world, leaving no trace behind. And then, 3 days ago, she had received a phone call from a man with a Korean accent who identified himself as David Park. He had somehow found her through the same veterans organization she had used, had told her about the funeral, about the bus, about the 30 people who were gathering to say goodbye. He had asked if she would come, if she would stand in her mother's place, and Sarah had said yes without hesitation. Now she sat on this bus, surrounded by strangers who were not strangers, people who shared a connection deeper than blood, bound together by the actions of one man who had refused to look away from suffering. She felt her mother's presence beside her, felt the weight of gratitude that Lynn had carried for 40 years and had passed down like an inheritance. The bus began to slow, and Sarah looked up. They were pulling into a rest stop, a small roadside area with picnic tables and a single flickering streetlight. The driver, an elderly man who had not spoken since they left the cemetery, turned off the engine and stood up. "We will stop here for a few minutes," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "There is something we need to do." The passengers filed off the bus in the same silent formation they had maintained all day. The air was colder now, the sun nearly gone, leaving only a thin band of orange light on the horizon. They gathered around one of the picnic tables, forming a loose circle, and the driver reached into a bag he had brought from the bus. He pulled out a stack of photographs, old and faded, protected in plastic sleeves. He laid them on the table carefully, reverently, and the group leaned in to look. The first photograph showed a young Henry Cole, maybe 25 years old, in military uniform, kneeling beside a small Korean boy. Henry was smiling, his arm around the boy's shoulders, and the boy was holding up a piece of paper with English words written on it in careful, childish handwriting. David Park stared at the photo and felt his throat close up. That was him. That was his handwriting. He remembered that day, remembered Henry teaching him to write his name in English, remembered the pride he had felt when he finally got all the letters right. The second photograph showed Henry with a group of Vietnamese children, maybe a dozen of them, all crowded around him in front of a makeshift school. Mein Nguyen found herself in the back row, her face thin and serious, her eyes still haunted by everything she had seen. But Henry's hand was on her shoulder, and even in the faded photograph, even across decades, she could see the promise in that gesture. "You are safe now. I will not let anything happen to you." There were more photographs, dozens of them, each one a moment captured in time, a piece of evidence that Henry Cole had been there, had done these things, had changed these lives. The group passed them around slowly, carefully, each person finding themselves or someone they recognized, each photograph a key that unlocked memories they had carried in silence for years. "He sent these to me," the driver said quietly. His name was Kim Sung-ho, and he was the first child Henry had ever saved, pulled from rubble in Seoul in 1952. He was 79 years old now, older than some of the others' parents, and he had taken it upon himself to organize this gathering, to find the others, to make sure Henry did not go into the ground alone. He sent them over the years, whenever he found them in his things. He never kept copies for himself. He said he did not need photographs to remember, but he thought maybe we would want them someday. Kim pulled out one more item from the bag, and the group fell completely silent. It was a small, worn notebook, the kind soldiers used to carry in their pockets, with a green canvas cover and pages yellowed with age. Kim opened it carefully, and Sarah could see that it was filled with handwriting, neat and precise, covering every page. "This is Henry's journal," Kim said, his voice breaking slightly. "He kept it during the wars. He wrote about each of you. Every child he helped, every life he touched, he wrote it down. Not for recognition, not for records, just so he would not forget, so that if something happened to him, someone would know that you existed, that you mattered." Kim began to read, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. June 15, 1953. Found a boy today in the rubble of a school, maybe 7 years old. Broken ribs, possible internal injuries. Got him to the field hospital. They say he will live. His name is David. He has his mother's eyes. She did not make it. I told him he is going to be okay. I told him he is going to America. I told him he is going to have a life. I will make sure of it." Kim paused, looking up at David, who was openly weeping now, his shoulders shaking. "He kept his promise," David whispered. "He kept every promise." Kim continued reading, entry after entry, each one a small window into Henry's thoughts, his fears, his determination. September 3rd, 1968. Met a girl today outside Da Nang. 9 years old. Lost her entire family. She has not spoken since it happened. I brought her rice and fruit. I will come back tomorrow. I will come back every day until she speaks again. Until she smiles again. She deserves to smile. Mai covered her face with her hands, remembering. It had taken 6 weeks before she spoke again, and Henry had been there every single day, patient and kind, never pushing, never demanding, just present. And when she finally did speak, the first words out of her mouth had been, "Thank you." The journal entries went on, chronicling years of quiet heroism, of sacrifices made without expectation of reward. Henry wrote about using his salary to pay for school supplies, for medical care, for plane tickets and visa applications and legal fees. He wrote about the children who haunted his dreams, the ones he could not save, the ones who died before he could reach them. He wrote about the weight of carrying so many lives, so many hopes, and the fear that he would fail them, that he would not be enough. But he also wrote about the letters he received years later, from children who had grown into adults, who had found him somehow, and written to tell him they were okay, they were alive, they had families and jobs and futures. He wrote about the joy those letters brought him, the way they made every sacrifice worth it, every sleepless night, and every dollar spent, and every moment of doubt. "He saved the letters," Kim said, pulling out a thick bundle of envelopes tied with string. "Every single one. He kept them in a box under his bed. When I went to his apartment after he died, I found them, hundreds of letters from all over the world, from people whose lives he changed, and he kept every one." Kim untied the string and began pulling out letters at random, reading snippets aloud. "Dear Henry, I graduated from college today. I thought of you. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Dear Mr. Cole, I got married last month. I wish you could have been there. You are the reason I am alive to experience this joy. Dear Henry, my daughter was born yesterday. I named her Hope, because that is what you gave me." The group stood in silence, listening, and Sarah realized that this was not just a funeral. This was a testament. This was proof that one person, acting with compassion and courage, could change the world in ways that rippled out far beyond what they could see or measure. Henry Cole had not commanded armies or won battles or made history in the traditional sense, but he had saved 30 lives. And those 30 lives had gone on to save others. to teach others, to love others, and the impact of his choices had spread like light through darkness, illuminating corners of the world he would never see. Kim carefully placed the letters back in the bag and looked around at the group. "He did not want recognition," he said, "but we owe him this. We owe him the truth that he mattered, that what he did mattered, that we are here, alive, because he chose compassion over indifference." The group nodded, and one by one they began to speak again, not telling their stories this time, but sharing what they had done with the lives Henry had given them. Mai talked about the children she had cared for as a nurse, the lives she had saved in her own way, carrying forward the compassion Henry had shown her. David talked about the bridges he had built, structures that connected communities and allowed people to cross divides, physical manifestations of the connections Henry had created between strangers. A man named Carlos Martinez, who Henry had pulled from a burning building in Saigon, talked about becoming a firefighter, about dedicating his life to saving others the way Henry had saved him. A woman named Hannah Kim, who Henry had hidden from soldiers who would have killed her family, talked about becoming a social worker, about helping refugees and immigrants navigate the same terrifying journey she had once faced. Each person had taken the gift Henry had given them and multiplied it, had used their second chance at life to create more second chances for others. And as Sarah listened, she realized that her mother had done the same. Lin Chen had become a teacher, had spent 40 years educating children in underserved communities, had poured into them the same hope and determination that Henry had poured into her. And now Sarah was doing the same, teaching the next generation, passing forward a legacy of kindness that stretched back to a helicopter lifting off from Saigon in 1975. The driver, Kim, reached into the bag one last time and pulled out a small wooden box, intricately carved with patterns that looked Asian in origin. He opened it carefully, and inside was a single medal, tarnished with age, attached to a faded ribbon. It was a bronze star, awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in a combat zone. "Henry earned this in Korea," Kim said quietly. "He never wore it. He kept it in a drawer and never spoke about it. But I found the citation when I was going through his things. He earned it for running into a burning building to save civilians. He pulled out 11 people before the building collapsed. He was injured, spent 2 months in the hospital recovering, and he never told anyone." Kim held up the medal, and it caught the last rays of sunlight, glinting softly. This is who Henry Cole was, a man who did extraordinary things and asked for nothing in return. A man who saw suffering and ran toward it, not away from it. A man who believed that every life had value, that every person deserved a chance, and who spent his entire life proving that belief through action. He closed the box and looked around at the group. "We are his legacy, not this medal, not any award or recognition. Us, the lives he saved, the families we built, the children we raised, the kindness we showed to others, because kindness was shown to us. That is what Henry Cole left behind. That is what will outlive him." The group stood in silence as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear overhead. The air was cold, but no one moved to get back on the bus. They stood together, 30 people from different countries and different backgrounds, united by the actions of one man who had refused to let them die. Finally, Kim spoke again. "There is one more thing," he said, "something Henry asked me to do, if he died before I did." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, with Henry's handwriting on the front. "To be opened after I am gone." Kim broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He read it silently first, his eyes moving across the page, and then he looked up at the group, his face wet with tears. He wrote this 30 years ago, Kim said, his voice shaking. He updated it every few years, but the message stayed the same. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. To those I was privileged to help. If you are reading this, I am gone. I hope you are well. I hope you are happy. I hope you have lived the lives you deserve to live. I never wanted thanks. I never wanted recognition. I only wanted you to be okay. That was always enough for me. You do not owe me anything. You never did. But if you want to honor my memory, do this. Be kind. When you see someone suffering, do not look away. When you have the chance to help, take it. When you have the opportunity to make someone's life better, even in a small way, do it. Not because you will be rewarded, not because anyone will know, but because it is the right thing to do. Because every life has value. Because compassion is not weakness, it is strength. Because the world needs more people who care. Be those people. That is all I ask. That is my last request. Be kind, help others, pass it forward, and know that I was honored to know you, to help you, to be a small part of your stories. You made my life meaningful. You gave me purpose. You were my family, even if we never spoke again after you left. I carried you with me every day. I thought of you often. I hoped you were happy. And I died knowing that I did something good in this world because I helped you. Thank you for letting me be part of your lives. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for thriving. Thank you for being exactly who you are. Live well. Be kind. That is enough. That is everything. With love and respect, Henry Cole. Kim folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. No one spoke. There were no words that could follow that, no response that would be adequate. They simply stood there, letting Henry's final message settle over them like a blessing, like a benediction, like a promise they would carry forward into whatever time they had left. After a long moment, they began to move back toward the bus, slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving this place meant leaving Henry behind. But as they climbed aboard and took their seats, Sarah realized that they were not leaving him behind. They were carrying him forward, in their memories, in their actions, in the lives they would continue to live, and the kindness they would continue to show. Henry Cole would go on living. The bus engine coughed to life, and they pulled back onto the highway, heading into the darkness. Inside, the 30 passengers sat in silence, each one holding tight to the gift they had been given. A second chance, a future, a life, and each one silently renewed the promise Henry had asked of them. Be kind, help others, pass it forward. It was a simple request, but it was everything. The bus drove through the night, and in the darkness, 30 people carried the light of one man's compassion forward into the world. A light that would never go out, a legacy that would never fade, a story that would be told and retold until the end of time. Because Henry Cole had lived, and because he had lived, 30 others had lived too. And because those 30 had lived, hundreds more had been touched, had been helped, had been saved. And the ripples would continue, spreading outward forever, a testament to the power of one person choosing compassion over indifference, choosing action over apathy, choosing love over fear. In a small cemetery on the edge of town, a fresh grave sat beneath the stars, covered with flowers from around the world. The earth was still soft, the mound still new, but already the ground was beginning to settle, the flowers beginning to wilt, the physical evidence of what had happened beginning to fade. But the truth remained. Henry Cole had not died alone. He had died surrounded by love, by gratitude, by the echoes of 30 lives he had saved, and the countless more lives those 30 had touched. He had died knowing that he had made a difference, that his life had mattered, that he had done something good. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for, to live a life of meaning, to help others, to leave the world a little better than you found it. Henry Cole had done that. He had done it quietly, without fanfare, without recognition. But he had done it, and the proof was not in medals or monuments or history books. The proof was in 30 people on a bus, driving through the night, carrying his memory forward, keeping his promise, passing his kindness on to others who would pass it on again, creating an endless chain of compassion that would stretch across generations and continents and time itself. That was Henry Cole's legacy. Not a name on a headstone, but a living, breathing testament to the power of human decency, the strength of compassion, and the eternal truth that one person, acting with courage and kindness, can change the world. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. The bus disappeared into the darkness, its taillights fading like distant stars, carrying 30 souls who had been saved by one man's refusal to look away from suffering. And somewhere in the night, in the silence between heartbeats, in the space between breaths, Henry Cole's spirit rested, finally at peace, knowing that his life had meant something, that his sacrifices had not been in vain, that he had done what he set out to do. He had saved them, and in saving them, he had saved a piece of the world. And that was enough. That was everything. End.